everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Maya Vinokur. I teach here in the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies. And today it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Branislav Jakovljevic, who is professor and chair in the Department of Theater and Performance Studies at Stanford University. He specializes in avant-garde and experimental theater, performance theory, and performance and politics. His first book, The Nilafant's Writing in the Event, came out with Northwestern University Press in 2009 and was crucial for me personally. I mentioned it. His most recent book is called Alienation Effects, Performance and Self-Management in Yugoslavia, 1945 to 1991. Came out in 2016 and examines the interplay of artistic, political, and economic performance in the former Yugoslavia. Alienation Effects won the 2017 Association for Theater and Higher Education Outstanding Book Award, as well as the Joe A. Calloway Prize for the Best Book on Drama or Theater for 2016 and 17. Today, Professor Jakovljevic will speak to us on the work of Russian psychiatrist Pavel Karpov, author of a pioneering book on so-called outsider art from the 1920s. The talk is entitled Madness as a Form of Knowledge, Pavel Karpov's Creations of the Mentally Ill. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Gordon Center for the invitation. I have to say that had it not been for this invitation, I would not have probably finished this paper at this time. So I actually started working on Pavel Karpov a few years back. Then I had to leave that in order to finish my book, and this was really great to go back to that material. So basically, just as a brief prelude, I'm talking here about two books basically that came out in the 1920s in quick succession. The first one is Hans Prinzhorn's Artistry of the Mentally Ill, which came out in 1922 in German, and 4 years later came out in Russian, Pavel Karpov's book Tvorчество умно-больных, which we can translate almost the same way, artistry or creativity of the mentally ill. So what's interesting about these two books, there is this fascinating instance of doubling remained unobserved, and Karpov's book went almost completely unacknowledged. So in this paper, I'm basically positioning Karpov's book in relation to Prinzhorn, and I'm going to show some of the artworks from Karpov's book, and I'm going to just reference one theoretical claim that Karpov makes, and that's going to be towards the end of the paper. The talk is around 43 minutes. When I start talking about and showing diagrams, it means there are some 5 minutes left. So if you doze off, you can wake up at that point. Madness is a form of knowledge. Pavel Karpov's Creativity of the Mentally Ill. From December 19, 1926 to January 6, 1927, Polytechnic Museum in Moscow hosted the exhibition Creativity of the Mentally Ill, which was accompanied by 6 lectures on the subject. Over 13 days, some 2,000 Muscovites braved the weather to see 600 works drawn from the collection of the psychiatrist Pavel Ivanovich Karpov, the head of the Commission for the Study of Creativity of the Mentally Ill at the State Academy of Artistic Sciences. I'll say more later about the State Academy. The exhibition followed on the publication of his book of the same title, Tvorчество душевно-больных, in Russian, which came out earlier in the year. The works that were on display that winter didn't survive. The collection perished. However, if we judge by Karpov's book, artworks in this exhibit most likely ranged from visions by paralytics to paintings made by epileptics to complex structures composed by paranoiacs. to works by patients with severe bipolar disorder, including a rare watercolor by Russian symbolist painter Mikhail Grubel from his Demon series. To the best of my knowledge, neither the exhibit nor the book and its author are mentioned in any extant histories of outsider art, both in Russia and in the West. Biographical details about Pavel Ivanovich Karpov are scant. Born in 1873 to a peasant or worker family in Moscow or St. Petersburg, Karpov graduated from Moscow State University Medical School in 1911 with specialization in psychiatry. Upon graduation, he worked in several mental asylums and hospitals, including Prechistnaya Psychiatric Hospital, which was affiliated with Moscow University. And after the revolution, he gained some professional prominence in psychiatric clinics and institutes in Moscow. And what's important for us, in 1923, he was invited to join the Russian Academy of Artistic Sciences. It is at this point that he started organizing, or at least presenting, his research on the art of the mentally ill. Initially, he was the head of the Commission for the Creativity of the Mentally Ill, and in 1926 he became the member of the Committee of the Institute for Study of Criminality and Criminals. In the same year, he founded Laboratory for Study of the Madness and of the Masses and Mass Psychotechnics. During the 1920s, he gave a series of talks in the Academy. Creativity of the Mentally Ill was his first book. It was published in 1926, which was followed by Everyday Emotional Creations in Old Russian Art in 1928, and following year he published Creativity of Inmates. In 1930, together with several other scholars, he was demoted from the position of a corresponding member to research assistant in the Academy. This was the beginning of the purge of GAN, as it was known, which ended with trials and arrests of its several prominent members, most notably the philosopher Gustav Speth. Last documents that mention Karpov are dated 1932. It is uncertain if he died of natural causes or fell victim to the purge. Ironically, the publisher of his last book, The Artistry of Prisoners, was NKVD, the infamous Russian secret police. Almost all of the information about Karpov's research that is available today can be credited to his affiliation to the Russian Academy of Artistic Sciences, and I will say a few words about this extraordinary institution. From 1925, it changed its name to State Academy of Artistic Sciences, hence the change of the acronym to GAN, and I will be referring to it as GAN. Even more than that, his theoretical insights into art of the mentally ill were fundamentally informed by and engaged with research agenda of this short-lived scholarly institution. GAN was initiated in June 1921, when in an effort to overhaul his ministry, the Minister of Culture and Education, Anatoly Lunacharsky, set up the Chief Art Committee tasked with setting up an Academy of Artistic Sciences, which was officially launched in October of that year. The Academy had three main departments. It was, to all accounts, an amazing institution. Psychological, sociological, and the first one was physico-psychological, the second one was sociological, and the third one was philosophical. Further, each department set its own commissions and cabinets that engaged in specialized areas of investigation, such as Commission for the Study of Literature and Criticism, Theatrical Commission, or for that matter, Commission for the Study of Creativity of the Mentally Ill. Experimental research was conducted within laboratories that brought together artists and scholars. For example, choreological laboratory that explored dance, and laboratory of metrotectonic analysis for research in music. The Academy was known as a gathering place of non-Marxist thinkers in Moscow in the 1920s. I'll give you a few names. Pavel Florensky was affiliated with the Academy, Nikolai Berjaev. If we go to closer to my field, Stanislavski and Emirovich Danchenko were affiliated with it, and also for a period of time Meyerhold. So there was really a broad section of Russian intellectuals that were affiliated in one way or another, or participated in the work of GAN. The further we go into the intricate structure of GAN, the more it resembles a living encyclopedia straight out from a Borges story. We find, for example, the Institute of the Living Word, I love that one, and the Commission for the Study of Time. The first three of the main departments to be established was physico-psychological, which was established already in July 1921, which means before the official launch of the Academy, and it was established under the directorship of the painter Vasily Kandinsky, who was also the founding vice president of the Academy. Kandinsky's tenure in the Academy lasted only some 6 months, from June to December, when he went to Berlin actually to establish, with the task of establishing the Berlin branch of the Academy. However, he left a lasting impact on this institution. Considering his interest in madness, which was evident in his early writings, such as on the spiritual in art and yellow sound, it is not surprising that already in the exploratory phase of GAN's existence in the summer of 1921, a group of scholars engaged in experimental research on art of the mental ill. That was one of the earliest activities in the Academy. It is quite telling that research commissions, labs, and other activities within physico-psychological department that were initiated over the years generally reflected the range of interest that Kandinsky and his collaborators presented in The Blue Rider, from medieval and non-European art to presentations of contemporary but non-academic art from Western Europe. It is unclear if Karpov was ever in a direct contact with Kandinsky. If not with the painter himself, he was certainly well acquainted with the work of his first cousin, psychiatrist Viktor Kandinsky, whose work on psychic automatism in the 1980s was as significant for the development of Russian psychiatry as Pierre Janet's was for French. Karpov and his group certainly benefited from other commissions within GAN, such as Commission for the Study of Primitive Art and Commission for the Study of Children Art. If we add to that the work of individual scholars in other corners of the Academy, such as Commission for the Study of Artistic Creativity and activities on gathering ethnographic material in many other departments, it would be not far-fetched to assert that for a few years in the mid-1920s, GAN was the leading institution in Europe for the study of what was later named outsider art. While the records of the purge of the prominent philosopher Gustav Speth and some other members of GAN were archived and eventually and recently published, there are no similar documents about Karpov. It is not clear if he was demoted and possibly persecuted because of his books. He was not a victim of strictest Stalinist censorship that would lead to the removal of his books from the libraries. And in fact, I found out about him while I was working on Harms. There are a couple of instances in the 1930s where in his notebooks Harms wrote, "I need to check out this book, Artistry." So I started looking for it, and it turned out to be an amazing book. So his book was available in the libraries in the 1930s in Soviet Union. Indeed, what could be dangerous about a book about outsider art, or rather an art book that featured 55 images, 11 of them in color? There is more than one kind of danger lurking in Karpov's probing of mad art, and not all of them are limited to political situation in the USSR in the late 1920s and early 1930s. At this exact time, for instance, on the other side of the continent, the group of surrealists engaged in experiments with psychic automatism in their attempt to uncover a new model of creative subject, as Roger Cardinal would say. Already in 1920, André Breton and Philippe Soupeau published Magnetic Fields, an early experiment in automatic writing, and, as it turned out, first surrealist publication that preceded the manifesto by 4 years. Breton abruptly ended his and Soupeau's work on magnetic fields, which he later repeatedly described as a dangerous book. Reflecting on this early endeavor in collective creation, Aragon suggested that one poet alone could not have produced this kind of work, where horrors and wonders might be encountered that would endanger the sanity of any one individual acting on their own. End quote. This and other similar excursions to real and perceived precipice of psychic disintegration prepared Breton and his group for the discovery, only a couple of years later, in 1922, of Hans Prinzhorn's Artistry of the Mentally Ill, which came to them, as the legend goes, fresh off the press in the suitcase of the painter Max Ernst, as a present to Paul Éliard, with whom Breton will collaborate on another literary exploration of madness, the Immaculate Conception. There is no evidence that Karpov was aware of Prinzhorn's book, which preceded his own by 4 years. He references a number of other works on the subject, such as Marcel Reja's Art of the Mad. And there is no reason why he wouldn't do the same with Prinzhorn, had he been aware of his work. In fact, he does precisely that in his book on the art of prisoners, which followed Prinzhorn's book on the subject, and there he comments on Prinzhorn, on the composition of the book and all of that. Apart from these overlaps in their scholarly interests, there are other significant points of resonance, both intellectual and biographical, in the work of the two psychiatrists. Both of them based their research on extensive collections of artworks by patients confined to mental hospitals and asylums. Also, they both expanded their research to other forms of naive and outsider art, specifically art of prisoners. They both benefited from new intellectual developments in Germany and Russia in the first decades of the 20th century, most significantly the new scholarly discipline of artistic science, Kunstwissenschaft. Prinzhorn was among young art historians who were invited to publish in Journal of Aesthetics and General Science of Art, edited by scholars who spearheaded Kunstwissenschaft in Germany. Gahn, whose leading members such as Speth and Alexei Losev already had strong intellectual ties with German philosophical tradition, specifically with Husserl and phenomenology, was the leading institutional proponent of this discipline in Soviet Union, which was indicated already in its title, Artistic Sciences. Some of the basic principles of Kunstwissenschaft can be seen as instrumental for the expansion of research into areas previously deemed unassimilable to art history. We need not look further than its removal of the ideal of beauty from aesthetic inquiry and its attention to non-aesthetic functions of art. That being said, neither Prinzhorn nor Karpov followed blindly the basic tenets of Kunstwissenschaft, but instead explored different avenues of research that it offered. Also, their explorations came to a stop in a quick succession. Karpov disappeared in 1932, and the following year Prinzhorn died of typhus. That's another uncanny kind of coincidence between the two of them. Upon its publication, Prinzhorn's Artistry of the Mentally Ill instantly became well known both in psychiatric and artistic circles. It had its second printing only a year after its original publication, followed by Prinzhorn's lectures across Europe and in the US. Artists made pilgrimages to Prinzhorn's collection as early as 1922, and as we have seen, the book's crossing of the Maginot Line became one of the foundational myths of surrealism. No such thing happened to creativity of the mentally ill. Karpov's collection didn't survive his purge, and almost the same happened to his book. It left almost no visible trace on Soviet avant-garde of the late 1920s and had no impact on Soviet psychiatry whatsoever. Like artists it showcased, Karpov's books was relegated to obscurity almost the moment it appeared. Not surprisingly, it escaped attention of art historians both within Russia and abroad. It would be erroneous to consider creativity of the mentally ill as a curiosity of early Soviet psychiatry and art history, and it would be even more neglectful to brand it as just another piece of evidence of the increased, as McGregor argues, interest in the art of the insane in the first quarter of the 20th century. All of these categorizations appear insufficient to depict a book that seems to collapse into its own subject matter and, under the pressure of institutional forces, joins that which it talks about. Second part. Is Dangerous Book a Mad Book? In his short text, Books by the Mentally Ill, Walter Benjamin notes that mere existence of such works has something disconcerting about it. This unsettling sense comes from the shift in the status of writing that a reader experiences in her encounter with a mad book. Precisely because it is commonly considered a part of higher, safer realm, as Benjamin writes, the appearance of insanity, especially when it enters less noisily than elsewhere, i.e. in a book, is all the more terrifying. In examples Benjamin draws from his small collection of books by insane authors, which he jokingly referred to as his library of pathology, as well as in numerous other cases, mad writing comes interspersed with all kinds of visual aids, drawings, diagrams, lists, maps, or burns and tears of paper in case of spells and letters, as in Artaud. Straddling the Great October Revolution, Karpov's book features, quite predictably, drawings by patients who presented themselves as kings and nobility. On the other hand, of the historical watershed, political power was no longer epitomized in the figure of the sovereign, but in the process of reinventing the state. Consider, for example, the case of Karpov's patient diagnosed with paranoia, who traveled to Moscow to ask the authorities for an allocation of some 27,000 acres of land in southern Russia, on which he would set up a commune for some 100,000 inhabitants. The commune builder, it's a beautiful plan. The commune builder laid in great detail his plans for the city, built, as he writes it, in a beautifully circular shape and made of white marble with glass roofs and circular streets without a beginning or an end. Karpov notes that this early Soviet utopia came illustrated with elaborate drawings and plans which, unfortunately, he did not include in his book, and hence they did not survive. It seems that his collection, which he often references throughout the book, was a library of pathology as much as a cache of drawings and paintings. Unlike Prinzhorn, who discusses writings of the mentally ill only insofar as they pertain to their visual works, Karpov's paper gallery is also an anthology of psychotic poetry, playlets, letters, tracts, and theoretical writings. There is a beautiful tract on poetry, actually, in the book. Divergence between Karpov's and Prinzhorn's approaches to art of the mentally ill is evident not only in principles they used in putting together their collections, but also in the ways they presented their material. The latter Prinzhorn privileged one psychiatric disorder over all others, which he clearly and famously demonstrated by using a large portion of his book to present in-depth case studies of 10 schizophrenic artists. So those of you familiar with Prinzhorn will remember that there is an intro and the conclusion, and the main part of the book is dedicated to 10 schizophrenic masters, as he called them. Conversely, Karpov seems at pain to distinguish between as many different psychiatric disorders as possible, so that dementia praecox, or schizophrenia, gets only one short chapter. In other sections of the book, he discusses progressive paralysis, paranoia, epilepsy, and circular psychosis or cyclotomia, bipolar disorder. These structural dissimilarities between two books come as a result of differences in Prinzhorn's and Karpov's methodological approaches to psychotic art, as well as their objectives when they engaged with this art in the first place. I will start from the latter first. If Prinzhorn's goal was to identify an authentic area of expression, an inner wilderness untouched by the procedures and institutions of culture, Karpov was interested in creativity in a broad sense of the word, an idea he indicates already in the title of his book, which reads in full for those of you who read Russian could see that. So the full title is Creativity of the Mentally Ill and its Role in the Development of Science, Art and Technology. Here, the sticking points are not science and technology, which he barely touches upon in the book, but the first word of the title, creativity. Unlike Prinzhorn, who attempts to narrow down the semantic area of his investigation by opting for artistry, bildnerei, over art, Kunst, Karpov strives to open it up as much possible by choosing tворчество, creativity, over искусство, or art in the narrow sense of the word. This word choice is all but random. Tворчество is one of key concepts in Gahn's Dictionary of Artistic Terms. So Gahn worked over 10 years on assembling a dictionary of artistic terms. Already in the opening on his entry on tворчество, the philosopher Pavel Sergeyevich Popov points to the dual meaning of this term, which denotes both, as he writes, creation as a product and creativity as process. While the first meaning certainly allows for semantic closeness with Prinzhorn's artistry, it is the second one that resonates with the intellectual direction of Karpov's research. Popov dedicates most of his entry to a discussion of psychological aspects of creativity, which he divides into three broad areas: methods of study, main factors in creativity, and process of its unfolding. Karpov expands on this schema by trying to identify the mysterious origin of creativity. Prinzhorn's training as an art historian was of central importance for his research in Heidelberg Psychiatric Hospital, and, as it turned out, for the broader recognition of outsider art. So Prinzhorn was trained as a psychiatrist and as an art historian, and was really pioneering, scholar in identifying some key features of outsider art. What set him apart from previous psychiatric investigations of psychotic art was his recognition of works created by psychiatric patients as artworks in their own right, and not as ephemeral results of occupational therapy. His vehement opposition to diagnostic uses of aesthetic objects is perhaps best exemplified in his often quoted quip, quote, "The conclusion that a painter is mentally ill because he paints like a given mental patient is no more intelligent or convincing than saying that Max Pechtein and Erich Heckel, who were German expressionist painters, are Africans from Cameroon because they produce wooden figurines like those by Africans from Cameroon." End quote. Unlike him, Karpov frequently made diagnostic conclusions based on artworks of his patients, guided by the idea that, as he wrote, "The mentally ill create according to the same principles as those who are in good health, but in their work there are recognizable symptoms of diseases from which they suffer." End quote. Even more indicative of their difference towards psychotic art is Karpov's frequent deployment of the idea of genius. This interest brings him close to the ideas of Cesare Lombroso, who wrote his influential book, The Man of Genius. It was published in 1864 and it was translated into Russian in 1895. One of the most striking instances in this regard is Karpov's claim that, quote, "If not all cyclotomics or bipolar patients are geniuses, then all geniuses are cyclotomics, who think according to the schema characteristic for patients afflicted with circular psychosis," end quote. This again can be credited to his focus on creativity rather than on creation dimension of the notion of tворчество. Still, there are significant intersections and overlaps between Prinzhorn's and Karpov's works on the art of the mentally ill. Some of them are unsurprising, and they come from their training as psychiatrists. For example, they both point out certain peculiar exhaustion, as they both write, characteristic for schizophrenic patients. They identify stereotypia in their visual works. And most importantly, they both recognize creative urge in the work of psychotic artists. The other area of overlap, which really fascinates me personally, is much more significant, and it comes from the works themselves, which reveal astonishing consistency of motifs and forms of expression between artists separated by significant cultural and institutional, and we can say medical, differences. Consider, for example, Prinzhorn's illustrations of ordering tendency as one of the distinguishing features of psychotic art. We find the same thing in Karpov. And the drawing by a so this is Prinzhorn, this is cyclotomic in Karpov. Further, both Prinzhorn and Karpov note the combination of religious and erotic themes in the works of some of their patients. Also, a drawing by a cyclotomic from Karpov's collection corresponds to certain less typical tendencies that Prinzhorn highlighted in his book. For example, combinations of multiple heads into a single body, or simultaneous depiction of a portrait in profile and en face. I find this image one of the most stunning images in Karpov's book. And needless to say, there are images in Karpov's book that provoke what Prinzhorn called disquieting feeling of strangeness, which he invokes in his depictions of works by schizophrenic masters. And these are two works. I find this one particularly impressive, and Karpov couldn't deal with it. He wrote about this really eerie image, devilish image, as an example of humor in the work of psychotic artists because of a note that the patient wrote next to it. Karpov rarely, if ever, commented on visual and aesthetic properties of the works he selected for publication. Mindful of his lack of training in art history, he went as far as suggesting that an expert from the field should also examine the works in his collection. Basically, he wanted an art historian to look at them. Even if he was remarkably disciplined in restraining himself from art historical judgments, there is an inherent aesthetic coherence at work in his choices of visual and literary works he considered representative of certain illnesses. For example, he seemed to favor trained over naive artists and figural art over abstract art. Typical for his aesthetic choices is a series of 7 works by a female painter who was admitted to his ward in a state of deep depression. All of the artists he comments, and all of the artists in his book are anonymous. He doesn't provide their name, not even pseudonyms, as Prinzhorn did. So all we know about this artist is that she was a professional painter who went into this deep state of deep depression and spent several months in the clinic. I'm still doing my research and I have some suspicions or who could that be, but I don't want to venture any guesses here. So this is the closest that Karpov comes to a case study in the fashion of Prinzhorn. So there are 7 pieces that he publishes and comments on. So the first one, he also provides the caption from the verse of the drawing. It says, "This is my pain. We have to understand it. This is its exact depiction, the way it brightly and painfully appears in my head." And then each image has a small kind of interpretation or written comment by the patient. This is her suffering and the bright world above her, and then slowly her depression lifts off. She still feels like a bird with her wings clipped, and then finally towards the end of her stay in the asylum, she feels liberated. And yet she soars upwards, but there is this heaviness that she carries with her. What Karpov seemed to value more than aesthetic properties of this patient's drawings was actually the temporary nature of her illness. She came to the asylum, stayed for a while, produced these drawings, and then she felt better and left and stopped making these kinds of work. So that's what he finds significant. He finds really significant this episodic nature of illness and artistic production. And this is third and final part. If Karpov's approach to psychotic art was not art historical, which is to say critical, it was not purely clinical either. Yes, he prefaced each chapter with an etiology of illness under discussion and did not hesitate to offer recommendations for treatment of certain kinds of patients. However, the end result of his study was concerned with diagnostics as little as it was with aesthetics. Instead, he used the art of the mentally ill to attempt no less than to outline a general configuration of human mind. The cornerstone of Karpov's schema is an idiosyncratic theory of the unconscious. Here, it is important to note that he consistently employs the Russian expression "podsoznanie," which is distinct from "bessознательно," a standard Russian translation of the unconscious, which is commonly used in psychoanalytic theory. While Karpov mentions Freud ad hominem only in passing and then criticizes his theory of dreams, he seems to concur generally with some aspects of psychoanalytic theory. For example, his notion of controlling consciousness is not dissimilar from Freud's idea of the superego. Also, like Freud, he is convinced that unmistakability is one of the main characteristics of subconscious, which leads him to describe it as categorical conscious. Unlike Freud, however, he outlines a topology of the mind which he maps in a series of 3 diagrams, which are significantly the only visual representations that appear in the last chapter of the book. The first one is the diagram of the self that maps the controlling consciousness. So this is Karpov. In his comments, Karpov starts from the bottom. So he reads the diagram from the bottom up with these triangular shapes that represent perceptions of qualities and actions. The 3 circles above them stand for psychic moments of elementary synthesis, which lead first to general perception and from there to memory, which is topped by complex psychical productions that reveal general mechanisms of thought, as he calls it. Writing, coincidentally, in the immediate aftermath of the period of sleeps that the surrealists had just concluded, Karpov adds to examples from psychotic art the cases of what he calls sleeping illness, which, as he notes, appeared in recent years in Europe and the USSR. He presents a case history of his own patient who, falling into a dreamlike state, at one time reached Caucasus Mountains before he regained consciousness, and at another traveled as far as Vladivostok in Russia's Far East. That's a long time, a long trip, from Moscow to there. He also discusses extensively a strange case of one Ansel Bourne from William James's The Principles of Psychology. Like Karpov's patient, this preacher from Rhode Island, falling suddenly into a state of slumber, wandered off and ended up in a nearby town where he adopted a new identity and set up a fully functional life as a small merchant that had nothing to do with his previous existence. Calling attention to the episodic nature of sleeping illness and of artistic outbursts of his patients, Karpov proposes that the dream is the waking state's other, in the same way in which madness is the other of healthy psyche. Using these rare insights into the subconscious, he concludes that it is organized according to the same principles as the controlling consciousness. So basically, the subconscious is the flip image of consciousness. Karpov adds to his second diagram the Roman numeral 2. So you can see it there. It is this second, other self, which is analogous to the conscious self and independent from it. He writes, this second personality is mastering synthetic process of thought and going through all psychic phases of the subconscious under influence of certain internal causes which he leaves unexplained. It feeds finished solutions into the stream of controlling consciousness. One of his main clinical insights concerned the intuitive process of creation, most often demonstrated by an ability to make conclusions based on insufficient evidence. So he claims that the genius, the inventor, and a bipolar patient they all have this capacity to use insufficient evidence to intuitively come with a conclusion. Significantly, he claims this to be the symptom of cyclothymia, bipolar disorder, and also often a mark of genius. In both cases, quote, the intuitive process is outside of the sphere of our intentionality and is completely under the power of internal sources wrapped in secrets of life processes of our organisms, end quote. Finally, here is the full picture of the creative process according to Karpov. Ideas shoot from the second self into the conscious self. They come fully formed, bypassing the entire structure that is necessary for our ordinary mundane functioning. According to Karpov, the principle of otherness is the main structural feature of human psyche. He writes, every thinking person should have a clear idea about that other life, which presents itself through various symptoms, different productions, other interests, end quote. Just to sum up the position of his theory vis-a-vis Soviet psychology and psychiatry at that time, there are three major aspects of Karpov's theory of the mind, and each of them seemed opposed to the overwhelming reliance on empirical rationality in Soviet theories of representation of the early 1930s, from Pavlovian reflexology in psychology to socialist realism in art. First, Karpov placed the unknown at the very source of creativity. Second, he eliminates labor from the process of the production of ideas. They come without warning and burst out in a flashing instant, only to vanish just as abruptly as they appeared. Finally and crucially, he depathologizes the art that he uses as primary evidence in his research, going as far as to suggest that those people, quote, who outstrip the ordinary schema of nervous central systems development may be unstable in the sense of psychic health, but they could also be further along in evolutionary process. As radical as they are, these are not the most dangerous ideas Karpov had to offer to Soviet medical and artistic communities. There is much that can be said about his diagram, and I will summarize quickly the final point. There is much that can be said about his diagram of the mind, its crystalline structure, or its symmetry and order which betray the same, shall we say, subconscious aesthetic principles that guided him in selection of examples of psychotic art he included in his book. I want to pause at one highly unusual feature of his schema, the designation of the upper and lower regions of the mind as self-awareness. Self-awareness instead of commonly used conscious and sub or unconscious. He left this unorthodox terminological choice unexplained. However, Karpov's work on the artistry of the mental ill was vitally informed, as I said, by his exchanges with other gun scholars. For example, his discussion of dreams is certainly in dialogue with psychoanalytically informed work of the head of choreological laboratory Alexei Sidorov, who gave a lecture, The Artistic Creativity of Dreams, shortly after Karpov spoke about his methods he was using to study creative activity. An even more direct exchange of ideas took place on May 5, 1925, when Karpov presented material from the concluding chapter of his book, so this material, back-to-back with psychologist Georgy Chelpanov's lecture, The Role of the Subconscious in the Creative Process. While these exchanges informed his research in some limited ways, neither one of them resonated with Karpov's theory of the mind as significantly as Gustav Spatz's theory of art as a form of knowledge. Bulletin Gunn characterized this lecture that Speth gave on April 7, 1926 as the most significant event of the year. It was followed by discussion on April 13th and 20th, so that in the end an audience of 200 attended this series of discussions. Only an outline of Speth's lecture survived, but even these cursory notes suggest the overall arch of his argument. In this, perhaps most radical proposition that came from Soviet tradition of Kunstwissenschaft, Speth approaches art as analogous, not auxiliary to science. In other words, he considers art not as a source material for the production of scientific knowledge, but as an autonomous kind of knowledge in its own right. The main epistemological difference, according to him, between science and art is in their objects of study. Whereas the former investigates the world, the latter explores the artist herself. Therefore, the proper knowledge of art is self-knowledge, or as Speth puts it, self-awareness. The prominence in that Karpov and Speth give to samosoznanie, self-awareness, is much more than a terminological coincidence. What both Karpov and Speth are after, each in his own way, is the absolute subject. This is the subject that Karpov plots in his intricate diagrams, a schematic and schematizable subject that springs from and at the same time preserves an obscure source that doesn't lend itself to scientific knowledge. Speth describes this subject as present existence, which is inaccessible to science. It is experiential, that is to say, empirical in an absolute sense. It is absolutely insuperable and unsurmountable, and absolute contingency, as he writes. And in that sense, it is non-objectifiable. Speth's idea of art as pre-reflexive knowledge of the self is inseparable from Karpov's idea of madness as pre-conscious experience that defies logical procedures. Anticipating anti-psychiatry debates that came some 4 decades later, Karpov is not asking what madness can tell us about human knowledge, but what madness knows, only to suggest that rather than an absence of knowledge or its distortion, it is an avenue into the very roots of all intellection. And that's where the danger lies. What is disquieting about this book is the fundamental disorder of knowledge it enacts. Convulsive, fitful, and self-denying, it is the book of knowledge that crumbled in its very gesture of its emergence. Okay. Yes, Misha.
Thank you, Branislav. So interesting. I knew nothing about this work today. But I think you're making this important comparison with surrealism and Prinzhorn. And of course, the context is very different because Prinzhorn and surrealism are in the context of attempts of certain part of European culture to overcome the shortcomings of rationality. In what is happening, of course, in Russia, we are dealing with a total obsession with rationality. Everything should be rational. The irrational should be absolutely destroyed. To some extent, it could be an explanation why Karpov was basically forgotten and didn't have any success, and Prinzhorn was successful. But when you are looking at the 20s and to these over-rational works and statements which are so important in Russia, you see from today's perspective that it's a total madness. I remember, for instance, I know Gottfried Benn description of Sergei Tretьяков, who is coming to Berlin as a mad person, who is talking to German writers, for instance, something like that. And of course, there is this feeling of over-rationality that is a kind of madness, and every kind of utopia that is developed, dreams that Karpov is interpreting and are becoming a kind of part of social utopia or social planning, all this kind of stuff, start to look as madness. Yeah. And of course, my feeling is when you are explaining his theories about this idea of symmetry between consciousness and madness as a pre-conscious kind of stage of something, and talking about this kind of, I don't know, sleeping illness, which is always there and starting to manifest. I'm asking myself to what extent what he's doing is really inspired by his intuition that we are living in a mad world. And this part of mentally ill could be a good key to the understanding of what happens in Russia in general. So maybe I am kind of, but of course I didn't read him, I have no idea, so this is my kind of first impression that he is talking about something specifically Soviet around this time, and Prinzhorn is talking about something specifically Western when he's printing his book.
Thank you, Misha. I think that's an excellent point. And Karpov, what I didn't have room to talk about, for example, in his book on the art of prisoners, where he compares himself with Prinzhorn, he's stating explicitly, I'm looking at the idea of an imprisonment in Soviet Union and how in our culture we can address some of the issues that are really some of the issues in the psychic life of prisoners that are expressed through these works. I was very much tempted by the thought that you just offered, that basically we can read this book or his series of 3 books which he wrote in the late 1920s as really a certain kind of blueprint or a map of a descent into madness. As Derrida would say, the law becomes mad. The law, the genre, is mad, right? So how are we to distinguish insanity from sanity and all of that? And again, it is my intuition that probably because of the trust he invests in this obscure source of creativity probably did him in. There is no evidence or no transcripts from his purge, so we don't know what the accusations were.
I just have a question. So this diagram at the end, is this artistic process or only the artistic process of bad people? And the reason I ask, because as you went on, it seemed like you were talking about general phenomenology of art, not the art of mad people. And that's a really, and so the assertion that you made, or that Karpov made, that all art is personal, you know. So I would say, you know, is that true of Aeschylus? Is that true of Shakespeare? We cannot find any person in Shakespeare, for example. It's very difficult. I mean, it's impossible if you take this whole oeuvre to say, what's the person? And it's even difficult in terms of the Greeks and also the Sanskrit authors. So is this about mad art, or is it about art?
He's using the evidence from his clinic of mad artists to make assertions about creativity in general. What is the source of creativity?
So he's assuming that creativity is individual.
Yeah.
And therefore, when we're talking about art, let's take the Chartres Cathedral, the rose window of Chartres Cathedral. So the rose window of Chartres Cathedral is certainly art, beautiful. It's very hard to call it an individual product, since the cathedral itself took 100 or more years to build, and the window, I don't know, took how long, and it involved, etc. So I mean, I find this extraordinarily interesting, but I also find its claim narrow, let's put it that way. Second thing is, I wonder if you know the work of Ernst Chris,
Yeah.
and his study of mad sculpting particularly, and it's quite Freudian, but I assume that this Karpov did not know anything about Chris's work.
Yeah.
And do you find Chris's work, if you know Chris's work, do you find it, how do you find it in relationship to this theory? Because he has a whole other scheme about so-called man, the final thing I would say. So that's the second.
Yeah.
And so I'll shut up after this. The third one is, you know, how would you map this onto Artaud, who's demonstrably mad and also extraordinarily influential? So, so those are my three.
Okay. I'll start from the last one, and I hope I'll remember the other two.
I'll remind you.
Yeah. Okay. So what I find very interesting about Karpov is his intentional, not anti-Freudianism, but leaving Freud aside. So apparently he is familiar with his work. He comments occasionally on Freud, but unlike Prinzhorn, who explicitly aligns himself with Freud, he is trying to produce an alternative, if you will, schema of the unconscious. And that schema, however strange it may seem with this kind of diagrams and crystalline structures, symmetries and all of that, when I look at these images, it almost reminds me of a chemical reaction. And it brings to mind what Deleuze and Guattari wrote about the molecular unconscious. And they relied very much in their work, as Alan knows, on Artaud and his so to say, case history. So I think there is more than one theory of the psyche and more than one theory of madness. And what I find interesting about and engaging, exciting about Karpov is that he puts together this edifice that seems almost completely divorced from the current streams in psychoanalytic, current ideas in psychoanalysis at that time. There was something else that I wanted to mention.
What about Chris?
He's not aware of his work, and it would be interesting to look and see if there are any kind of similarities there. Another thing that I find also quite extraordinary is that this work was completely neglected. I looked at the books on outsider art in Russia, no mention. Really, really strange. So, in some ways, I think there is something really interesting that's going on there that goes towards your point, Misha, and that is that there is a certain kind of, how should I say, certain similarity in the fate of this book and this theory and the works that it talks about. So it seems ephemeral, discarded, dispersed in this state of social madness, as you indicated, and it, like many works pre-Prinzhorn by mad artists, it was considered ephemeral, insignificant, and just disappeared. What was your first point?
Mine was about collective, and that this is about individual art, and there's a great deal of art in the world that is collective.
Yes, yes, and I would need to look. There are some of his things that are still in the archives in Ergali in Moscow. It's interesting that one of the things that he was researching was mass art. He was the founder of the laboratory for mass art and mass, how did he call it, psychotechnics.
Right.
So if we consider the prominence of spectacles and celebrations in
Especially for the Soviets, right?
yeah, post-revolutionary Russia, it's not surprising that that's one of the areas that
That
he
would be
was
very
studying. Yeah. Also, his second book is on folk art in Russia, which is again collective creation or anonymous creation.
This is both a question and just a short comment, but are you familiar with the artist Hilma af Klint?
No.
They just had an exhibition of her work. She's recently been quote-unquote rediscovered. So a lot of her work is built around the idea of how, the same questions that Karpov was asking, like, where does the unconscious and creativity come from? How can we map it? What does it look like? And I was just thinking about her images, and they actually so resonate with both his outlines of the unconscious and the work that you were showing of the anonymous woman who dealt with her depression.
Yeah.
It's almost as if you could marry the two, you would find that in Hilma af Klint's work. And so it's really amazing. It might be just worth for you looking at, because there's so much formally and theoretically
What's the
there.
name?
Hilma? No, not Clint, not Gustav Klimt. Hilma af Klint.
Oh, off.
Yeah, A-F-K-L-I-M-T. She,
Thank you.
yeah, she was very committed to, I guess, what was the term that you used? Psychotechnic art, the same idea, where writing in like different states of consciousness and drawing in different states of consciousness. That was a lot of how her work was produced. And yeah, there was at the Guggenheim.
She was a
She's in the Guggenheim.
Yeah, there was. Yeah.
Her stuff is in the Guggenheim.
Yeah.
No longer.
I think
It's
Oh,
yeah,
no
I think
longer?
it's-
Oh.
There's several.
That's all.
So I might have missed this at the beginning, and I
Yeah.
apologize. Do any of the works remain? Are they in any collections? And then have they ever been exhibited?
There was one exhibit in 1926, right after the publication of his book. They exhibited some 600 works from his collection. And as far as I know, the collection perished together with Karpov, so it did not survive. The only things that survived, there are no images. I couldn't find a picture of Karpov himself. There are these 3 books. His publication survived, and in the archives of GAN, there were outlines of 3 or 4 of his talks that he gave. So there is very little that survived behind him. Another difficulty here is that he is so strictly protecting the identity of his artists, so they're all anonymous, we can't identify them, there is no Wolfly or really a schizophrenic master that would emerge even from the book itself. I find 2 or 3 drawings quite stunning, I pointed them out. There are a couple of other color reproductions that are quite fascinating. But apparently there were many, many more works. For example, the commune, I would love to see the drawings of that commune, but the collection is not there.
Is there enough information about the commune to have a graphic designer reconstitute something?
I think that could be done. He describes the city in quite some detail. So yeah, we could. It's amazing. And another Misha thing about Soviet Union. What makes Karpov also unique is that his research bridges pre-Soviet and Soviet period. So his work on Rubel, for example, came before the revolution, so he started that research before 1917, and then he added new case studies, new evidence after, and you can see clearly this fixation of power especially with kings, tsars, nobility, and then the commune, right? So there is this political, historical watershed that leaves the mark.
But
on
in
the
the pre-revolutionary context, it's not astonishing because of
Yeah,
fundamental
yeah.
mysticism,
Yes, yes.
hallucinations,
Yes.
madness
Yes.
was very kind of fashionable topic. So
Yes.
Google, it's not something that
Yes,
is,
yes.
but when we are dealing with this topic,
Yes. Post,
and fundamentally what is happening, the rationality pushed to the extreme, to the absolute, is becoming an absolute
yes,
madness.
yes,
So the distinction
Yes.
is evaporating. This
yes.
is
Yes.
what is happening, something
Yes.
which is very different, of course, from revolution.
I also find much more interesting these instances of psychosis after the revolution. You're right, pre-revolutionary is pretty standard. It's,
But this structure of symmetry
uh-huh.
is quite interesting. This
Yeah.
mirroring of
Yeah.
rationality
Yes.
and madness here.
Yeah, he calls the dotted line, that's how creativity works. You can't read it here. He calls it punctier. So really,
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. I just wanna, before I ask a question, I have a little comment. So last night I've been to this presentation. It's a talk between Sarazi, an artist, and the Nobel Prize winner who got the Nobel Prize for his research in science on olfactory, how our olfactory system functions. And the main talk that they had is about this mental cognitive mapping. How does our brain function? He said an interesting thing about how for each of us a certain smell maps out when the neurons flare up, they map out a certain pattern that on the other stage the brain kind of reads and kind of translates into a certain feeling and emotion, or like certain kind of smell. But he said that also what scientists cannot analyze, there is a moment where for each of us this mapping has been, after being deconstructed and reconstructed, has been different. And what they came up with is the notion of how it's connected to the experience. And again, what I found is when you talk about the notion of absolute subject, that doesn't lend itself to the analysis, and according to Karpov, that is actually completely empirical. That kind of like resonates to me to what contemporary science has to say to it as well. But my question is, how does he write about it? How does this like a principle of otherness connects to this absolute subject within his philosophy or his kind of...
he says that other within us is an inherent part of the subject. We are denying it, it's overlooked, it's, Freud might say repressed, but no, he says it is the constitutive really part of the subject. We can't really exist without it. Another, yeah, there.
Well, you might have said about this about the beginning, but I'm fascinated by the book history of this book. How many copies were made? How was it produced? You said something about how many color prints, but maybe then you were speaking about the Prinzhorn. Because my very limited experience with outsider art is it's so bespoke and unusual in its materials and form and shape and dimensions. And then the idea of like trying to put this into a book is of course so crazy in and of itself, and you sort of suggested this a bit. So I wonder if you could draw that out a little more.
So there were 2,000 copies that were printed, which is for Russia or Soviet Union not a huge really print run. I find it interesting that it was published by GAN, Academy of Artistic Sciences. It ended up in libraries, was never removed from the libraries, so even during Stalinist purges, it just stayed there. He was not completely airbrushed from Soviet history, but very much overall. Another thing that I find very interesting is the institutional really context of production of this knowledge, of this book. So he was the head of the Commission for the Study of Art History of the Mentally Ill in GAN, and it was not a kind of ghost operation. He was the head of a small department, and he had several assistants who worked with him at the clinic. And part of the reason, I believe, why most of the artists were not, why he didn't comment more extensively on these artists that he, whose works he published in the book, was because his assistants actually picked them up and did more work on them. So I know that one of his assistants did the work, more comprehensive case study on the depressed painter with 7 pieces in the book itself. There was another one who, I can't remember which particular artist, but in my research I came across several instances in which his assistants actually picked up on this work and developed it further. Also, in Ghana, apparently they had a good practice of sharing the work, so they would present their work and other scholars would come. So he presented his schema and the idea of samosouznanie and all of that a year before Speth did his talk about art as a form of knowledge. So there was a lot of exchange going on there. The academy was shut down abruptly, so they did not really have an opportunity to wrap up some of these research projects.
But printing this book with all these color plates and stuff, was it an unusual thing in terms of the Ghan's output, or did they have often photographic images of specific part of the patients or something?
Color plates were unusual. Ghan had 2 publications, the Bulletin, which summarized the ongoing work that was taking place in the academy, and a journal, Iskustvo, Art, which was richly illustrated but no color plates, and they had longer essays, reports, and there also another thing I find very interesting, and basically they were very much aware of the developments in Western Europe. So as I said, Kandinsky was, according to some reports, instrumental for the founding of the academy. It was at he instigated the whole idea. So he was even when he left and lived in Berlin, he was in touch with his colleagues, wrote to them, he was very present at the academy, and then also the others traveled west, so literary scholar Peter Kogan. He went to Paris in 1924 and came back with a report about surrealism. Not very flattering, but they knew what was going on.
Yeah, I thought something interesting you said actually about the forms and the irregularity of pieces. Until Dubuffet starts collecting, there are almost no 3-dimensional pieces that are collected. And one of the reasons is it's simply easier to put a lot of flat pieces of paper in a drawer. And this has been true through much of the history, even post-war. But what strikes me is that, in fact, most of the paper is regular. Most of these artists, patients, were working with what was available, and it was standard paper. So, in fact, what's getting reproduced in all of the books, Morgenthau, Prinzhorn, in this case, it's works on paper. It's drawings on paper. And what's interesting, I don't know what the case is here, but the basis of Prinzhorn's theory, the Gestalt in question, the origin of the creative act for him is non-objective scribbling, which suggests the graphic and not the 3-dimensional. So the works that were reproduced were, in Prinzhorn's case, the ones that happened to be amenable to his theorization of the creative act.
And so you're saying that the 3-dimensional would give us a different theory?
I'm asking the question, yeah. It would be interesting to think that through.
Because that's what Chris is dealing with, because he's dealing with sculpting.
Yeah.
And there is one artist in Prinzhorn who, if you remember, who does the sculptures. So that's basically there in Prinzhorn we have photographs. But otherwise, yes, there works on paper. I agree with you. The same we can observe the same with Karpov. Basically, his aesthetics is very much informing what he's including and excluding from the book. So really, he apparently liked figurative art. The series of inner experiences of the depressed artist are almost like cartoon schemas of how she feels. That's why I find that these works, and especially this one, really.
But I think it wouldn't make a difference because, as you said, what he's interested in is not the product, but the process, the creativity as a process itself.
No, I think Prinzhorn was also an art historian. He was he was very interested in the
Yeah,
product.
Yeah.
Prinzhorn, but not Karpov.
Karpov.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So you mentioned this patient who, like, she had these 7 pieces, and then she left the asylum, and I don't know, maybe didn't return there. And you also mentioned that Karpov seemed to have this particular interest in like temporary or transient mental illness, which I guess it makes sense if you think about him as being actually interested in the like what madness knows, right? Because then the transition from a state of madness to a state of sanity is especially important. But was he also studying like the therapeutic value of producing art, or was that also like how did that relate to his other ideas?
Good point. He comments along the way. So he's a psychiatrist. And like Prinzhorn, he never studied art history. He was apparently interested in art. So throughout the book, he makes comments of purely kind of clinical observation. So this patient found it very soothing, this cyclotomic, to produce a number of works, and it is he's interested in the moments when they start and when they end. Some of them never left the asylum, and those cases were less interesting to him for the claims that he was trying to make.
But why? I mean, like, isn't it? I don't know. I guess I don't understand. I don't necessarily yet understand the connection between someone who's like temporary. Like, why is it more valuable to look at someone who's temporarily insane and the works they produce in that temporary insanity than somebody who's permanently and constantly insane?
I get your point.
Yeah.
I think what he seemed to have found valuable is the similarity, certain kind of resemblance between temporary madness and sleeping illness. In the final chapter, he goes into a lot of detail about sleeping illness and how people can fall into that state of how should we call it, otherness, where they change their identity, they can't remember their previous self, and they seem to be fully functional. So to go into a state of slumber and travel from Moscow to Vladivostok in 19 teens or 20s, and that's a long and complicated journey. And he seems fascinated by William James's example of this preacher from Rhode Island who who went to a bank, withdrew all of his money, and then just switched his personality, went to the city next door and started a new life. It's
Maybe he
interesting.
just wanted to start a new life and it wasn't crazy at all.
Apparently.
What better way to get rid of your old life? Take all your money, go to the bank.
It's very interesting that didn't happen on his way to the bank. So, but anyway, I think that kind of lacune in the life of the psyche seem to fascinate Karpov, and he isolates them in an attempt to get to this idea of how the creativity works.
Just to clarify from what you've described in his work, he's referencing various different types of mental illnesses with different durations and different just temporalities within it, and seems that there's a lot to be gleaned from each experience, because those are the larger questions. So that's why maybe he would look at someone who's going through a temporary and severe depression, maybe that she would fall into some later period in her life, we wouldn't know that. And then also simultaneously look at someone who's going through something that's quite long-term and chronic. So,
And he really insists on, unlike Prinzhorn, on not privileging one mental disorder or illness or over the other. So he really insists on giving the as broad a range of cases as possible. So schizophrenia is one small, really chapter, but then when you look at his cases, most of them would fall into the broad, as we know, schizophrenia is a very ambiguous diagnosis. So his cyclotomics would, bipolar disorder patients, most of them would fall probably in this broad, ambiguous definition.
it's so fascinating. There's a lot of theories right now on the schizophrenias, because there's so many. I mean, this feels, so much of what you just referenced feels so incredibly cutting edge within American and European ideas around schizophrenia, and also more acute mental illnesses. So it's just fascinating to think about this historically.
You need to read Karpov. Yes.
I was wondering if there was any collaboration at the time around theater or dance of the mentally ill, because the example already from William James is a kind of performance act, that is moving away from kind of drawing to turning a kind of a making through performance.
Don't get me started. Really, there are a couple of dissertations there in performance studies, in the work that was produced at GAN. Again, I didn't have time to go into it, but for example, chorological laboratory, which dealt with dance, and there was the lead scholar was very much interested in psychoanalysis. They did an amazing work, and it was really practice of dancers and scholars working with them. It is well documented, hundreds and hundreds of photographs that range from really analysis, all very close to biomechanics, to something that would resemble the photographs from Charcot and his patients, but extremely well documented. Nicoletta Missler published a thick book in Russian, and I wish it was translated into English. It's amazing. And several major works on Stanislavski. I think if we don't take into consideration the work that was done in theatrical commission of GAN, we get a very, very incomplete idea here of Stanislavski's work. So
that would be good to bring this into English, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, there are a couple of scholars who worked with him and published books and articles throughout the 1920s. GAN was the only institution where Nemirovich, Danchenko, and Meyerhold brushed their shoulders. Meyerhold couldn't stand him, and yet they were both affiliated with GAN. So there was some really, really interesting work going on, and it's slowly coming out.
Thank you all so much.